Eric and Larry for inviting me to be a part of this symposium. Like I said, we're going to change directions just a little bit here and leave that microphone sitting up there. And hopefully you guys can hear me in the back. I'll try to project really well, okay? I was tasked with talking about the integration of targeted grazing with other vegetation management strategies here. So a little different than what you guys heard this morning when we talked primarily about livestock distribution and how we might select for that on the landscape. So you know we have a variety of different tools that we use for vegetation management on rangelands, right? We have all these tools because of the simple fact that no one single tool works for every problem that we have. If we did, we wouldn't all be sitting here in this meeting talking about the complex issues that deal with rangelands. We'd have a problem, we'd apply treatment A, and we'd move on with life, and we wouldn't have these interesting discussions and reasons to meet at this meeting and the bars afterwards and everything else. But we know that rangeland is a complicated ecological place and that there's a lot of things going on there. So we've developed all these different tools that work differently in different plant communities and different soil structures and different terrains and all of that. And we try to apply those tools as they would best fit the landscape. Well, it turns out that some areas are suitable for the use of more than one tool, maybe 3, 4, maybe all different types of tools. And the more we can explore the potential to integrate these tools and to combine them, the more we could potentially increase our effectiveness when we want to talk about vegetation management. So if you take these tools and you integrate them, which is simply the combination of 2 or perhaps more of these tools on the landscape to accomplish a goal, we get a couple of things. Hopefully, we get a more complete achievement of our objectives because these tools have additive or synergistic effects even on the landscape, where one tool might increase the effectiveness of the other one when applied together. A lot of times we can get there more rapidly if we integrate these tools together than we could if we simply repeated the application of a single tool over and over. And then when we combine these tools and we get that more rapid control, that more complete control, usually that's easier on our pocketbook as managers than if we keep doing the same thing over and over again. Well, one thing to keep in mind as I go through this presentation and talk about potentials for integration and give you some examples on it is that even though integration means a combination of these tools, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're applied simultaneously either spatially or temporally on the landscape. A lot of times you're not spraying the exact same time that you're grazing, and you're not burning the exact same time that you're grazing, but you can separate those out temporally on the landscape to complement each other. And you might even do it spatially a little bit, where you attack this section of perhaps an invasive plant infestation one year with one tool, and then you apply another tool over here, and then you swap them spatially in different years, okay? So keep that in mind as we go through this. I'm going to start with probably the oldest example of the integration of 2 management tools that we have here. If you were at the plenary session yesterday, you got a pretty good grasp on fire and the ecology of fire and how it's used on the landscape. And when we talk about integrating these management practices, one of the other things to keep in mind too is usually with the first treatment, you're going to be altering the vegetation structure or composition in some way to make that second treatment more effective. Sometimes we apply grazing first, sometimes we apply the other treatment, but our goal is to hit it with one and set up our other treatment to be successful, okay, by altering the structure or the composition of that plant community. So I lined out just a few ways that we might use grazing to help set up animals to be more successful in a targeted grazing situation where we're trying to accomplish a specific vegetation management goal in the landscape. We might use grazing to manipulate fuel loads and to control or modify fire intensity. We know we can remove biomass with grazing animals, and that can help us control a fire if we were going to run it into that area a little bit later. We can use that grazing to reduce seed set of annuals or even perennial species prior to fire, so we can impact that seed bank before we apply that second treatment on it. And then if we want to use that grazing to help us be a little bit safer when we do a prescribed burn, we might be applying a fire break similar to this one down here in Kuna, Idaho, where they used some animals to create that strip on the vegetation so they didn't have to worry about if they wanted to do a prescribed burn on that. We can also use fire to set up our grazing animals to be more successful by using it to top kill tall brush. If you're trying to do a brush management program and you want to use goats, if you got anything up above what a goat can reach on its hind legs, he's not going to be very effective at getting it. So we might need to knock that down, make it more accessible to those animals. We can also use it to set up that soil to be more receptive to restoration after we have gone through with grazing, and get rid of some of the rest of those seeds on it and release the nutrients within that area as well. So let's look at a specific example that I pulled up out of the literature talking about potential ways that we could integrate fire and grazing, and this one is for cheatgrass control. And these examples are certainly not the only ones that are found in the literature, but I thought this was a really great example of a kind of a cyclical process where they used cattle grazing and then prescribed fire to integrate together to really manage a cheatgrass population. So what Diamond and his colleagues did was they looked at targeted cattle grazing in the early spring whenever that cheatgrass was in the boot stage, trying to target about a 70 to 80% utilization on it, as I recall. And their goal was to reduce the seed production and the biomass before they put fire out there on the landscape. After they had had that intensive grazing, they were then able to come into that really cheatgrass dominated community in the fall and use a prescribed fire to remove the litter that was on the soil surface and all of the seeds that were caught up in that litter. So they had kind of a double whammy against the seed production for cheatgrass that year, and they were able to really have a nice fire that they could control the intensity of. And they also, by getting rid of that litter, removed some safe sites for seed germination of anything that was left on that site. They came back in and they grazed it the following spring because they did have some plants come up, and those plants were actually quite vigorous and produced a lot of seeds, but the grazing was sufficient enough. Their density and biomass on the landscape was reduced enough that grazing alone then could take care of the seed production that year. But by integrating those two managements, they achieved a control and a suppression of that cheatgrass population that wouldn't have been possible, at least not in that time frame, using any one of those methods alone. So let's look at the combination of grazing and herbicides. There's been a couple of examples. Primarily, I'm going to pull from the weed control topics when I talk about this, but again, along the same lines with fire, we can use herbicide to set up those grazing animals for success by altering that plant community structure. Maybe we want to get rid of something that's in the way. We can open up that canopy and let those animals get down into something that's underneath it. We can also change the age class of a plant community. Some research in Montana where they took an older population, I'll talk about it here in a minute, and then sprayed it and let the animals concentrate on the younger plants. And we can also use a combination of grazing and herbicides to just keep shrinking the size of that infestation down at a quicker rate than either of those methods alone. On the other hand, we can use grazing to try to set up our herbicide treatments for success. We can use it to remove some of these overstory plants so that we have better herbicide contact on a target plant that we'd like to control, because maybe it's on the understory of a shrub species or just a larger plant that's got more of a canopy there. We can also use it to reduce seed set, try to set up that seed bank to where we don't have a flush of new growth following herbicides because there's been less added to the seed bank over time. And we can also use it to delay the phenology to buy time for treatment. You can't be everywhere at once with herbicides, and that's it, especially when you've got a noxious weed problem and you're supposed to spray when that plant sets flower. The whole world is yellow and you've only got so many hours in a day to do that. If you can use some strategic grazing to delay the phenology, even by a couple of days or weeks on part of that population. It gives you time to get around to a little bit more of it and get a more thorough treatment of it. Okay? So let's look at a couple of examples. The first one's by spotted knapweed. And this time they used a herbicide application followed by sheep grazing. So they went in with a very low residual herbicide, just 2,4-D. They did a one-time application on spotted knapweed. And with that, they killed the adult plants in that plant community, just top killed them. But no residual, right? So here comes a whole flush of seedlings and new growth in next year. Well, those seedlings, those rosettes, are more palatable to the sheep and they're more preferred. And so they got even better utilization by the plants on that. And together they had more reduction in density than either herbicides alone or grazing applied alone. In leafy spurge, they did it the opposite way in North Dakota. They looked at applying the goats first and then following up with a herbicide treatment. So this time they used the goats to prevent seed set on it till the treatment could be applied. They also used the grazing of the goats to stress that root system so that when they applied that herbicide later in the fall, they got a better root kill on the herbicide. It was more effective there. And again, they found that the control lasted longer than either method applied alone. That's another benefit of integrated management a lot of times, is what you're seeking for is not only just quick control, but you want that control to last so you don't have to keep treating it or come back as often to treat it there. So the goal was definitely reached in that situation. Grazing and mechanical control, I stole a picture of one of John's super juniper eating goats here, but he's got that branch all pushed down. He's doing his own, he's got his own program to increase accessibility to forage. But at the same time, we can still do that if we use some of our mechanical treatments prior to grazing. It helps a lot with resprouting trubs. You go in there with mechanical and then you can use these animals as a maintenance treatment afterwards for it. And not only when you do that, but a lot of times that regrowth is less toxic, more palatable, more attractive to those animals. And so they can do better on it, consume more of it, and you can have more control that way. You can also knock it down, make it more available for them. Do the same thing with mowing too, particularly if you've got some decadent, wolfy plants that are really tying up your canopy, knock those down and use your animals to control the regrowth on them. And it's also more attractive and more palatable. Some cultural control methods, you think about seeding, fertilization. A lot of times you can use your livestock to prepare a seed bed. Maybe use some trampling, help increase that soil seed contact, improve germination rates if you do it correctly. And then fertilizer, there's been an occasion or so where they showed that if you used grazing to reduce the initial population of the weed and then applied a fertilizer, that the animals could control the weed, but then the subsequent vegetation, the competing vegetation, would increase with those increase in available nutrients there. And then I even put grazing can be integrated with grazing, because good grazing management, one of your goals should be to improve your vegetation complex, to maintain the sustainability of your operation, to keep yourself with a good forage base. We can also use targeted grazing along with that to help maintain that forage base and follow it along. Jeff Mosley and a graduate student and a couple of other colleagues up in Montana did that when they were looking at integrating a good cattle operation, grazing operation, with some really targeted sheep grazing to try to increase knapweed use and improve the overall forage quality on the place. One of the other ones that I want to talk about is the integration of targeted grazing with insect biological control. It's a big deal for people who are dealing with these noxious weed infestations, spotted knapweed, leafy spurge, because the insect biological controls in the grazing have two very similar strengths. And that is they're very well suited for large open areas that lower productivity, probably not going to justify the widespread application of herbicides from an economic standpoint in that plant community, and pretty rough terrain. They can both be applied on that. So sometimes people have looked at them and they've either they've lumped the sheep into the same category as biological control, which the insect people get really grumpy when you do that, because they've gone through a ton of tests to make sure that those insects don't even look at, much less sniff or take a bite of anything else besides what they're supposed to before they're brought over here. And so they snub the idea of sheep being biological control, or cattle or goats or any livestock, because not only will they eat the target plant, they'll eat other stuff too that's attractive to them. So there is very distinct differences in the diet selection of these animals. And then there's, but biocontrol, even though it's been heralded as, you know, the best way, right? We've got these plants that are invasive because we've released them from their natural enemies. So if you bring them over, it should bring everything back into balance. The system hasn't worked that way in most cases. You have a few cases where it's been quite successful, but most of the time, biocontrol alone is only effective in about 30% of the cases, okay? So this is a relatively, I won't say relatively new, but there's not been a whole lot of research looking at it, and so there's potential for synergistic effects. You get multiple herbivores chewing on the same plant, stressing it out all through the year. Higher utilization, you would expect that to cause more damage to the plant. And then if those herbivores take off the seed heads, and you've got a seed head feeding agent attacking that, you can concentrate them and get those populations up to level in those remaining seed heads to really cause some damage. But there's also concerns about it, and quite frankly, the biggest concern that I hear is, well, those darn sheep or cows or goats are going to eat all my bugs. I've put them out there and they're just going to eat them, right? Because they're in the seed heads, they eat the seed heads, they eat the bugs. And so by doing that they can interfere with the growth and the population growth and the stability of that biological control population. So I'm just going to bring forward a couple of cases where they've looked at that with leafy spurge up in North Dakota. And they documented that they had increased control when they used targeted grazing in conjunction with the Aphthona flea beetle on that. And then also a study done in Idaho on yellow star thistle, they were able to document that if you grazed with cattle and sheep, you didn't actually impact the population of those insects that were there to control yellow star thistle. This is a graph from a study that we're working on currently up in Montana. We've got some sheep grazing knapweed, and these blue bars are the insect biological controls alone, and these two tan bars are grazed either in July or in August. And this is the number of viable seeds that are added per meter square. So even though we've got a really healthy insect biological control population, we're still getting 154, 524 viable seeds per meter square. When we integrate that with targeted grazing, we're knocking those numbers down to 1, 0, 2, and 19 viable seeds per meter square on that population. That transmits into fewer seedlings here after a couple of years of grazing. Again, this blue bar is just the insects alone. These others are with grazing. So we're getting 56 to 86 new plants per meter square with just the insects, not doing a lot to control our population. But when we add those grazing animals, we're down to 6, 7, 16 plants per meter square on that. And we've also done studies, and we determined too by the insect populations that our grazing animals on the landscape are not interfering with the ability of those biological control insects to maintain their population out there. And they together, when we integrated them, we reduced the seed production by 99% more than just the biological control alone, which translated into 5 times fewer seedlings in those paddocks that we used both methods together rather than just the insects alone. So we'll just wrap it up again with kind of, as John did in the first half, just a little bit of review about the importance and the power and the potential for integrating these different management strategies with grazing so that we can use either grazing or one of the control tools to set up the next one for better success, more complete achievement of objectives, and probably get there more rapidly than we could if we used either of those methods alone. So I'll take any questions if we have a minute, Derek.